You think winter is bad because your heater broke for a day? Oh, sweet summer child, let me take you somewhere colder, not in temperature alone, but in spirit, in bone, in the very marrow of daily existence. Welcome to medieval Europe, where winter wasn't just a season, it was a merciless, recurring apocalypse. And for the peasants, those uncaped crusaders of mud and misfortune, it was an annual fight for survival with no hero's reward at the end. Just the quiet, grateful wheeze of waking up with all 10 fingers still attached. Imagine, if you will, a home not built to keep the cold out, but seemingly designed to let it settle in with its shoes off and a cup of bitter tea. You're standing in the middle of a one-room hovel, and every surface around you is either frozen, wet, or suspiciously squishy. The walls? Mud, straw, and a generous helping of cow dung, nature's original building adhesive. The roof? Thatched, leaking, and sagging under the weight of snow and time. Windows? Please, if you were lucky, you had a hole covered with an animal skin that waved like a sad little flag of surrender. Inside, the temperature hovered politely just above freezing, because that was all your structural engineering allowed. If it was 25 degrees outside, congratulations. It was maybe 27 degrees indoors. And that's if your fire hadn't given up trying to burn wet twigs in the night. Darkness didn't just fall in medieval winter. It swallowed everything. The sun bowed out before dinner, and you were left with a flickering hearth fire trying to fight off the gloom, a task it was wholly unqualified for. That fire, more sputter than flame, would warm the toes of whoever dared sit closest, while the others learned that physical distance from fire was measured in degrees of frostbite. Clothing? No magical goose-down jackets or fleece-lined boots. You wore wool, rough, unprocessed, itchy wool, layered like you were a medieval onion. And if your cloak smelled faintly of goat, well, that's because it had previously been one. Underwear? Optional. Hygiene? Seasonal. Layering was both a fashion statement and an act of desperation. The general idea was to wear every piece of cloth you owned at the same time, in hopes of trapping at least some warmth or shame, whichever came first. Beds, such as they were either piles of straw stuffed into sacks, or just piles of straw thrown on the ground, like an elaborate welcome, mat for vermin. And by vermin, I mean fleas, lice, and the occasional spider just trying to survive winter like the rest of you. The straw would flatten, mold, and reek with impressive speed. But hey, it kept your backside off the freezing dirt floor. Sort of. And the floor. Let's talk about that glorious, mud-caked, frost-kissed floor. Made of compacted earth, it was a breeding ground for dampness, draftiness, and despair. During particularly wet winters, it could actually rise up into the house like some malevolent marsh monster, turning every footstep into a sloshy reminder that you had chosen, wrongly, to be born in the Middle Ages. It was like sleeping inside a refrigerator that leaked. So how did anyone survive? How did these poor, frostbitten, turnip-sucking humans live through the kind of cold that could chill a ghost? Simple. Grit, ingenuity, communal stubbornness, and just enough dumb luck to not be the one closest to the drafty window hole that night. They packed rags into cracks. They rubbed animal fat on walls for insulation. They huddled together, humans, goats, pigs, and the occasional chicken, in a chaotic, snoring pile of shared body heat and questionable hygiene. Privacy didn't exist. Comfort didn't exist. But survival? That was earned. Every single frigid, flea-bitten night. They even developed medieval HVAC systems, by which I mean they dragged their livestock indoors. A cow's body heat is surprisingly effective when your home is a glorified tent made of mud and disappointment. You haven't lived, or rather barely survived, until you've tried to sleep while a pig farts under your bed of hay. And the fire. Oh, the fire. It wasn't ambiance. It was life. Letting it die overnight wasn't just inconvenient. It was suicidal. and because relighting a fire in freezing darkness without matches meant striking flint with frozen fingers and prayer. Families developed fire banking, the art of burying embers under ash to keep them alive until dawn. Entire family arguments could break out over fire banking technique. Tight ash or loose ash, dry moss or damp hay. Survival hinged on the tiniest, smokiest decisions. Of course, not everyone made it. Infants, the elderly, and anyone who rolled too far from the fire in the night often didn't wake up. Every morning that you did wake up was a minor miracle. And if you managed to do it with all your extremities intact, you might have celebrated with a slightly less frozen root vegetable. But here's the real kicker. These people didn't just survive winter once. They survived it every year, over and over again, with the same broken house, the same itchy tunics, the same smoky air, and the same half-dead fire. They didn't have electric blankets. They didn't have vitamin D gummies or thermal socks. They had raw determination, some moldy straw, and the absolute refusal to die because of a cold Tuesday in January. So next time your thermostat dips below 68 degrees and you find yourself reaching for a blanket with mild annoyance, spare a thought for the medieval peasant who was probably awake at 3 a.m., poking at dying embers with a stick while a goat sneezed on him. Because this, dear viewer, is not just a story about cold. It's a story about the human spirit, wrapped in 4 layers of goat-smelling wool, shivering beside a pig, and praying the fire makes it to morning. Stick around. We're just getting warmed up. Let's get one thing straight. When we say home in a medieval peasant village, we're using the term with the same creative flexibility that lets people call a shed a tiny house today. But at least the modern shed has insulation, a roof that doesn't actively betray you, and probably a ring light for TikTok. The medieval peasant home. Imagine if someone tried to build a house out of sadness, livestock waste, and broken dreams, and then invited the entire family to live in it through a Siberian-grade winter. First, let's talk about the walls. They weren't walls in the way you think of walls. These weren't neat, painted drywall and stud structures. These were wattle and daub monstrosities, woven wooden lattices smeared lovingly with a generous spread of mud, straw, and cow dung. It was medieval stucco, if the stucco had come from the digestive tract of your neighbor's livestock. The frame? Bare timber, chopped and hammered into place by someone whose understanding of straight lines came exclusively from watching trees grow. This was less architecture and more earthy suggestion. And the holes. Oh, the holes. Gaps in the walls, spaces between beams, places where the mud crumbled off like cake from a poorly frosted dessert, each crevice a whispering conduit for the biting cold, like the house itself was conspiring with winter. These weren't minor drafts. They were full-blown air vents large enough to let in a rat or several. Think of it as Mother Nature's way of ensuring constant ventilation, whether you wanted it or not. And don't get too excited about the idea of a ceiling. Because while, yes, there was technically a roof above your head, it was a thatch of straw and sticks, tied together with prayer and the occasional dead mouse. Water leaked through when it rained. Snow melted and dripped onto your forehead at 3 a.m. And wind? Wind didn't knock politely. It came screaming down the chimney-less hole, flipping over pots and extinguishing your sad little fire. Your ceiling wasn't a barrier. It was an emotional test. Now let's talk insulation, if you can call it that. There were no fiberglass rolls, no foam panels, no double-glazed anything. What they had was manure. Glorious, pungent, perpetually available manure. Cattle dung, pig dung, even human waste. Anything was fair game in the fight against the cold. It was smeared over walls and packed into cracks like the world's worst caulking gun. Imagine a home where the same material that fertilizes your turnips is what's keeping you from becoming a medieval popsicle. The ceiling space, if there was one, was sometimes sealed off with a plaster-like material. And by plaster, We again mean, yes, manure, mixed with straw and whatever organic garbage they could find. It worked surprisingly well at trapping heat. It also worked very well at trapping odor. That lingering barnyard aroma wasn't a byproduct of peasant life. It was peasant life. A natural scent diffuser, if your preferred scent was wet livestock on compost. Now you may be wondering, why not just build better homes? Why not fix the holes, use stone, or invest in doors that actually fit their frames? To which the medieval peasant would respond, with what money, what time, and what tools? These people didn't have contractors on speed dial. They didn't have speed, or dial. Every improvement was done with bare hands, sometimes barefoot, in between working 14 hours in the fields and praying you didn't die of dysentery. And let's be honest, these houses weren't designed to last. They were temporary fixes to a permanent problem, being poor in a frozen climate. You didn't build a castle. You cobbled together a survival hut and hoped it wouldn't collapse on your children mid-blizzard. Each mud patch, each new smear of poop-based plaster was an act of resistance, a declaration to the cold. Not today, winter, not today. These weren't homes in the cozy sense. They were glorified barns, but without the sense of order that even animals demand. And ironically, some of them were barns. In the coldest regions, livestock were often housed indoors, with the family. Not because people were weird, though maybe, but because animals gave off heat. A full-grown cow can be a living radiator. A pig, a squealing space heater. Sharing a room with them was more hygienically questionable than medically advisable, but you were warm, and that counted for more than dignity. So, was it a home? Was it a house? Technically, legally. Not that anyone was checking, but spiritually, emotionally, this place was closer to a pen. A muddy, drafty, poop-insulated pen where hope came in the form of a fresh pile of straw to sleep on and the absence of pneumonia that week. And here's the haunting truth. Even with all its flaws, with its cracked mud walls, frozen floors, and constant manure ambiance, this house was precious. It was everything. It was a shield, albeit a porous, wheezing, disease-ridden one, against a world that was actively trying to kill you. It was the difference between sleeping and not waking up. And for a medieval peasant, simply not dying was enough to qualify a building as home sweet home. So next time you complain about your apartment's thin walls or your roommate's questionable hygiene, take a moment. Breathe in that, relatively, fresh air. And be grateful your ceiling doesn't drip goat pee, your walls don't sweat methane, and your insulation isn't still steaming from the cow it came from. Because if you had to choose between a modern heating bill and a 14th century mud hut scented like despair, trust me, you'd thank your HVAC with tears in your eyes. If the walls were misery and the roof a loose threat, the floor was where hell quietly crept in from underneath. Imagine waking up every morning on what can only be described as a damp, semi-sentient patch of filth masquerading as flooring. It wasn't wood. It wasn't stone. It was just earth, but not the friendly kind you garden in. This was earth, with grudges, trampled, soaked, spit on, slept on, and only technically better than sleeping directly on a glacier. Medieval peasant floors were compacted dirt, and depending on your luck, they ranged from mildly soggy to actively plodding. Hypothermia. Now, in a world without radiant heating, this posed a problem. You see, cold doesn't just enter through the windows or the roof. It creeps up from below, like a ghost that specializes in ankle trauma. The peasants knew it. They felt it. And they fought it in the most inventive ways. Let's talk about the carpet. And we use that word as generously as possible. If you were a noble, you might have imported Persian silk, or woven tapestries, or even animal hides. But if you were a medieval peasant, congratulations. Your carpet was a humble, composting blend of straw, reeds, old rushes, and whatever plant. Matter hadn't already turned into soup. This wasn't decoration, it was insulation. A patchy, crinkling mulch layer of organic despair, scattered across the floor in a last-ditch attempt to not wake up frostbitten. Now here's the fun part. That layer, they rarely changed it. Not because they didn't want to, but because changing, it was a whole ordeal. You had to gather fresh rushes, which took time, tools, and enough daylight to not get bitten by a wolf. And besides, here's the dirty little secret. They thought old compacted rush layers were actually better at keeping in warmth. The logic went. The older and more mashed together it was, the better it insulated. Sure, it also trapped moisture. Bacteria, rotting food, vermin, feces, and the occasional decomposing frog. But hey, warmth is warmth, and warmth came at a price. That floor became its own biome, teeming with tiny life forms who didn't pay rent and had no respect for your toes. Fleas, lice, beetles, and other uninvited guests thrived in the mulch. You could sweep them, stomp them, curse them, even pray at them. But they always came back, part of the great circle of medieval life. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, you'd swear the floor was breathing. You were wrong, of course. It was just rats tunneling through. Let's not skip past hygiene. You're thinking, couldn't they clean the floor? Let's be real. You can't sanitize dirt. And medieval brooms were basically sad bundles of twigs that moved grime around like a toddler pretending to mop. Pee? Soaked in. Food scraps? Composted. Into the rush. Mud from your boots. Blood from butchering day. Spit from someone hacking up a lung. All part of the mix. It was less a floor and more a marinating stew of domestic history. That brings us to the special joy of nighttime. If you slept directly on that floor, and many did, especially the children, you weren't just enduring discomfort. You were actively absorbing winter into your bones. The ground acted like a reverse stove. It pulled every bit of warmth out, of you, and replaced it with damp existential despair. People would wake up stiff, aching, half frozen, with toes that felt more like icicles than body parts. Some tried to elevate themselves slightly, using old crates or bundles of hay to stay off the worst of the chill. But many had no such luxury. And even those who had straw beds, still only inches off the ground, still soaking up the same cold draft that drifted in with a vengeful whisper. Every inhale was sharp, and every exhale fogged into a room that couldn't remember the feeling of room temperature. But even with all that horror, peasants still innovated. They'd patch up holes in the floor with more straw or even manure. Yes, again with the manure. Because once it dried, it formed a hard crust that kept some warmth in. Think of it as medieval floor repair. No tiles, no cement. Just creative. Use of biological waste. There's a reason nobody romanticizes medieval flooring in movies. There's no hearthside romance when your date involves bedbugs and frostbite. And yet, this was normal. This was home. No one questioned it because everyone was too busy surviving it. You didn't complain, you adapted. You layered your feet in old cloth, bundled them in animal skins, stuffed hay into your shoes. You moved constantly, never letting your blood slow. Some families even kept dogs or cats purely as heat sources, living slippers to sit on your feet while you tried not to freeze. So next time you feel the cold on your polished hardwood, or whine about stepping on a Lego barefoot, picture this. Your entire house resting on a bed of rot bugs and frost. You're walking across it with a lantern flickering and no socks, the floor crackling underfoot like the last crunch of dignity. Then imagine doing that every single day, for your entire life, knowing there's no escape, no renovation, no flooring upgrade coming in next month's budget. Welcome to the ground war of the Middle Ages, where the chill didn't just come from outside. It rose, steadily, relentlessly, from beneath your own feet. When you picture a fireplace, you probably imagine something out of a holiday movie. a crackling hearth, warm light flickering across wooden beams. A golden retriever curled up nearby while someone sips hot cocoa and pretends winter is whimsical. Cute. Now forget that. Medieval fireplaces were less cozy corner of the soul and more carbon monoxide chamber with a personality. If you lived in a peasant home, the hearth wasn't a place to gather. It was a place to gamble your lungs. Let's start with the basics. Fireplaces in the medieval countryside were crude. Brutally crude. Imagine a shallow fire pit dug into the center of the room, perhaps surrounded by stones or scrap bricks, with no chimney, no flue, no ventilation system unless you count the gaping holes in the walls that already let in the wind, rain, and the occasional rat. The result? Your home's number one source of heat also became the number one source of choking, coughing, and slow burn respiratory failure. You think secondhand smoke is bad? Try full frontal, open-air campfire inside your house every single day. The smoke didn't go up and out. It hovered. It lingered. It curled around the rafters and soaked into the thatch roof until everything, including your face, smelled like you'd been slow roasting in despair. The air was so thick you could wave your hand through it and feel resistance, like swimming through disappointment. You didn't breathe in your own home. You inhaled the memory of fire, and yet it was essential. That fire was the heart of survival. If it went out, your chances of waking up as a frostbitten meat popsicle rose dramatically. So, people huddled close, as close as possible. The coveted spot was right beside the flames, within that precious radius of heat. These were prime real estate zones, the center of the medieval universe. Children, the elderly, the ill, anyone with polar pity clung to the fire like it owed them money. The rest? Well, they sat further back and hoped their extremities didn't turn blue before bedtime. But the irony? The closer you got to the fire, the more damage you took from the smoke. You might feel warm on the outside, but inside your lungs were building calluses. Peasants developed coughs that never quite went away, their voices raspy from years of breathing in ash and particulates. It's said that in many homes, the ceilings turned jet black with soot. And you know what else turned black? Teeth, clothes, noses, and occasionally, pets. If your goat walked through the house too often, it started looking like it moonlighted as a chimney sweep. Why no chimney, you ask? Because chimneys were a luxury, an expensive architectural feature reserved for the rich, churches, and anyone who didn't want to live inside a smoker's lung. Most peasant homes relied on the "let's just hope it drifts out eventually" strategy. A small hole in the roof, if they were lucky, or maybe a slit in the thatch. But in winter, you didn't want to open anything too wide, because, death by cold. So the smoke stayed in, and you learned to live with it, or rather wheeze with it. This leads to an unexpected upside. Yes, there was one. The smoke, while suffocating, had a secondary function. Pest control. That constant haze in your one-room home acted like the world's saddest bug bomb. Lice, fleas, mites, even bedbugs. Many of them just couldn't take the fumes. They fled, or died, or simply went dormant, possibly out of pity. In a weird, dark way, your lungs were a trade-off. Sure, said life, you'll be coughing blood by 30, but hey, at least the fleas won't be biting your eyelids tonight. The fire also doubled as a cooking station, but let's not get too romantic. You cooked over it by hanging, a pot on a hook, or balancing it on the coals, and praying it didn't tip over or catch your tunic on fire. Smoke got into everything. Every bite tasted like firewood and fatalism. You didn't need to season your food because it already came pre-flavored with soot and desperation. And because there was no separate kitchen, all of this happened in the same space you slept, ate, and occasionally gave birth. Welcome to open-plan medieval living, and don't forget the risk. Fire was not a tame companion, it was a frenemy. Homes were dry, flammable, and tightly packed with straw, cloth, and oxygenated misery. A single spark could mean the difference between barely surviving and burned alive in your own mud hut. There were no fire departments, no water buckets lined up like in colonial reenactments. If a fire broke out, your best bet was to run outside, scream for your neighbors, and form a panic circle while everything you owned turned into embers. Sometimes the fire you fed to stay alive came back to collect. Still, the hearth remained, the center of life. Stories were told around it. Meals were eaten beside it. It was the closest thing to a television. The flickering glow hypnotized, comforted, and distracted you from the bleak, frost-bitten misery surrounding you. And for some, it was spiritual. Fire represented warmth, life, even divine presence. To keep the fire alive was to keep your family alive. Letting it go out wasn't just an inconvenience. It felt like an omen. In the end, your relationship with your fireplace was a complex one. It warmed you. It fed you. It poisoned you slowly. It kept you alive and constantly reminded you how close you were to death. It didn't ask for gratitude, just vigilance. You stoked it like a lover, feared it like a god, and cursed it like a drunk uncle. And through it all, the smoke never left. It lingered in your home, your hair, your skin, your dreams. So the next time you stand in front of a clean, modern gas fireplace with a thermostat on the wall and a carbon monoxide detector above your head, take a moment to appreciate the miracle of not having to breathe in half a tree just to feel your fingers again. Medieval peasants didn't have that luxury. They just had smoke, soot, and a daily test of how badly you wanted to keep your lungs. Let's get one thing straight. In medieval winter, fire wasn't just heat. It was hope, breath, heartbeat, and the psychological glue holding entire families together. And if you thought a fire was simply something you lit and forgot, welcome to the harsh, slow-burn reality of fire banking, the unsung medieval ritual of babysitting embers like they were royal blood. Because if that fire went out overnight, it wasn't a small inconvenience. It was code red. It was death with a frosty handshake. You didn't start a fire each day. That was amateur hour. You preserved one. And you did it like your life depended on it. Because, plot twist, it absolutely did. Fire banking wasn't optional. It was an essential life skill, like knowing how to swim, if the swimming pool was made of snow, and the lifeguard was a piece of burning wood buried under cow dung. So what is fire banking exactly? In the modern world, we turn off the lights and expect them to come on again tomorrow. Medieval peasants didn't have that privilege. If the fire died, you weren't just cold. You were plunged into a darkness so thick and frigid it made your bones consider early retirement. Matches, lighters, spark buttons, none of that existed. Starting a fire from scratch was a painful, frustrating ritual that involved friction, flint, or if all else failed, begging your neighbor like a caveman version of borrowing sugar. That's why the smart ones didn't let it die in the first place. The trick was to bank the fire before going to sleep. Not with coins, but with ash. You'd rake the glowing coals together into a tight pile, like cuddling them into a little ember nest. Then carefully smother the top with ashes. Not too much, or you'd suffocate it. Not too little, or it would flare up and burn out. Just enough to keep it breathing, invisibly. Under that gray powder, the fire lived in secret, like a fugitive hiding out until sunrise. Checking that, hidden ember became a nighttime ritual. Quiet, sacred, a kind of medieval love language. Fathers, mothers, even children would wake in the middle of the night to check the hearth. Not because they couldn't sleep, but because they couldn't afford not to. You'd approach that banked mound with trembling fingers, brush away a bit of ash, and peer in, searching for the dull, pulsating glow of survival. If it blinked back at you, you exhaled. If not, cue the panic. And sometimes, even when everything looked fine, when the ash was thick and the embers warm, people swore. They saw things, shadows dancing in the corner of their vision. Flickers not of flame, but of something else. Fire had that effect. It didn't just warm the room, it warped it. In the deepest hours of night, when the wind howled outside and your family snored, beneath lice-ridden blankets, that little red eye in the hearth took on a life of its own. It whispered. It flickered. Was it a sign? A ghost? Just imagination fueled by smoke and starvation? Or the spirit of fire itself, keeping silent vigil as the frost crept in through the walls? Of course, there was a hierarchy of firebanking talent. Some people had the touch. Their fire never died. Their ash layering was precise, their embers glowing until morning like faithful old dogs. Others? Let's just say, their firebanking skills were the equivalent of putting a plastic bag over a candle and hoping for the best. Entire families would mock each other over it. Remember when Uncle Rolf let the fire die and we had to warm our feet by screaming? Yeah, that sort of mistake wasn't soon forgotten. And if you did let the fire die, your punishment was starting from zero. That meant scraping together dry twigs from under wet snow, finding kindling that hadn't already been burned, and praying to every known deity that the flint would spark. Some folks even carried embers in special clay pots when traveling, wrapped in straw to keep them alive, because if you arrived somewhere and there was no fire, you better have brought your own, or get ready to cuddle up with frostbite. Firebanking wasn't just a personal skill, it was communal insurance. Villages depended on each other. If your fire went out, you could knock on a neighbor's door and beg for a coal. But there were no guarantees. Maybe their fire had died too. Maybe they were sick of sharing. Maybe the last time they helped, you didn't return the favor. Social currency in a frozen world was made of embers, not gold. And speaking of gold, let's talk about how the hearth became the emotional vault of the home. The act of banking the fire wasn't just about warmth, it was an act of resistance. Every carefully placed ash was a middle finger to winter, a whispered promise. Not tonight, Frost. Not on my watch. There was pride in keeping the fire alive. It was a small victory in a world that didn't offer many. And children? They learned early. Firebanking was a coming-of-age moment. You didn't get your medieval adult badge until you proved you could keep that flame breathing till dawn. That meant waking in the night, crawling half asleep to the hearth, shielding the coals from wind with your body, and murmuring ancient bedtime lullabies that sounded suspiciously like curse words. It meant respect. It meant responsibility. And, yes, it meant dirty fingernails and burned sleeves. Sometimes in the morning, you'd uncover the fire bank and find nothing but cold, gray dust. And for a second, your heart would stop. Then you'd dig a little deeper. And there, like buried treasure, a faint red gleam. A single ember. Just one. That was enough. You'd blow on it gently, whispering like a priest to a dying god. Feed it straw, sticks, hope, and slowly, the fire would return. A little flame, licking the sides of the hearth, promising another day of heat, smoke, and survival. So no, firebanking wasn't about ashes. It was about life. It was about family, ritual, fear, and stubborn defiance in the face of an uncaring season. Every glow in the darkness was earned. Every ember preserved was a refusal to freeze and vanish. And the next time your power goes out, and you light a candle to keep the mood romantic, remember that in another time, someone was crouched over a hearth in a house made of mud, whispering to glowing ashes like they were holy relics. Firebanking wasn't just medieval survival, it was medieval intimacy. And like everything intimate, it burned. If you've ever complained about sharing a bed with someone who snores, try bunking with a goat that farts in its sleep. Welcome to the medieval warmth strategy no one talks about in fairy tales. Cohabitating with your livestock not just because they're cute and fluffy, but because without them, You might literally freeze to death. This wasn't some weird peasant quirk or an early eco-friendly lifestyle choice. It was survival math. Humans lose heat. Cows, pigs, chickens, goats, they all generate it. And in a world where insulation was made of manure and windows were just holes you stuffed with hay, having a few breathing radiators that also occasionally laid eggs, that was a win. A smelly, noisy, sometimes dangerously hooved win, but a win nonetheless. Let's start with the basics. Heat from milk and fur. Livestock aren't just mobile food reserves. They're walking heaters. A cow runs a body temperature of about 101.5 degrees. That's warmer than most humans during flu season. Pigs clock in around 102. Goats? A solid 103. Now multiply that by an entire barnyard shoved into your living space, and congratulations. You've got a medieval hot yoga studio. Except instead of incense and calm music, you get methane, feathers, and the occasional rooster jumping on your face at 3 a.m. Peasants didn't build separate barns because they didn't have the luxury. Many homes were the barn. In fact, the architectural design of some medieval cottages literally included a partition that separated humans from animals with nothing more than a flimsy wall, or sometimes just wishful thinking. In winter, that wall might come down altogether. Who needs personal space when your toes are freezing off? And this wasn't limited to cows. Chickens roosted in rafters. Pigs curled up near the hearth, snoring like drunk uncles. Goats nibbled on whatever you forgot to hang high enough. Even the family dog, if they had one, played their part in the huddle for heat mission. In those moments, the household became a weird snorting organism, a mix of grunts, snores, breathing, and the faint rustle of straw as everything alive tried to pretend the temperature outside wasn't actively plotting murder. Everyone had a role. Humans arranged themselves around the fire, but livestock often formed a secondary heat perimeter. You could call it temperature zoning, medieval style. Kids might snuggle up to the family pig, who, by the way, didn't mind as long as they weren't mistaken for dinner. Chickens perched wherever body heat was leaking, which usually meant your head. And cows, bless their massive milk-producing hearts, just lay there, exhaling warmth into the cold like hairy, cud-chewing space heaters. Now, let's talk about trade-offs. Heat is great. Warmth is essential. But this arrangement came with an unmistakable aroma, one that stuck to your clothes, your hair, your soul. Picture a scent cocktail of ammonia, wet straw, and unwashed everything. Add in the constant soundtrack of animal bodily functions, and you've got the kind of rustic ambiance that makes modern camping look like a 5-star spa. But no one cared. You didn't complain about the smell if it meant your fingers stayed attached. You didn't flinch at the snuffling snout of a pig pressed into your back if it meant you could sleep without chattering teeth. You accepted that the price of heat was the obliteration of personal hygiene standards. The smell wasn't gross. It was life. The stink of survival. There was also an unspoken bond here, something primal. Sharing space with animals wasn't just about using them for heat. It was about coexisting with the only other living things that seemed to understand the cruelty of winter. When everyone's breath fogged the same frozen air, hierarchy blurred. You fed the chickens and milked. The goat in the morning and at night, they helped keep your children warm. You didn't see them as just animals. They were co-workers in the business of not dying. Of course, not every night was peaceful. Pigs can be aggressive. Goats are jerks. Chickens are loud and unpredictable. A startled cow might crush your firewood stash or your grandmother. And stepping barefoot into a fresh pile of cow dung in the dark was the kind of sensory experience that left emotional scars. But again, better dung than death. That was the unofficial motto. And let's not forget the practical brilliance of this arrangement. Animal breath helped raise the ambient temperature. Their movement stirred the air. Their waste, when it wasn't tripping hazards, added an extra layer of ground insulation. You didn't need a thermometer to know the goat corner was the warmest spot in the room. You could smell it. This blend of biology and necessity also rewired how peasants saw comfort. There was no such thing as gross in a freezing house. Everything was judged on a single scale. Does it keep us from freezing? If the answer was yes, then pass the pig and get under the straw. Body heat was currency, and everyone, two-legged, four-legged, feathered, or furry, was part of the warming economy. In modern times, we've gone out of our way to separate human from animal. We have pet beds, crates, barns, kennels, fences, litter boxes, entire industries based on containment. But medieval peasants? They knew the truth. Sometimes survival means embracing the mess. Sometimes warmth comes with hooves. So next time you see a farmhouse painting with a chicken on the windowsill or a cow in the yard, don't romanticize it. Real medieval peasants weren't frolicking in the snow with rosy cheeks and woolen mittens. They were curled up next to a steaming pile of hay, nose to nose with a goat, whispering to their own breath clouds and praying the pig didn't roll over onto the baby. Because in a world without thermostats, HVAC, or even glass windows, the only thing standing between you and hypothermia might have been a very affectionate sheep. Or, more realistically, a farting pig who didn't know personal boundaries, but had the decency to be 102 degrees. In the Middle Ages, the word intimacy didn't mean candlelit dinners or long walks on the beach. It meant pressing your frozen butt cheek against someone else's frozen butt cheek and praying the combined temperature might hit lukewarm before morning. Welcome to the medieval cuddle puddle, a survival strategy where the human body wasn't just a vessel for the soul. It was insulation. And when the cold came clawing at your door like death wearing an icicle crown, you stacked up like lasagna and hoped to God no one farted in their sleep. The human sandwich strategy was not romantic. It was primal, functional, strategic. When your house was a glorified barn with mud walls, zero insulation, and more holes than your uncle's fishing net, heat wasn't just comfort. It was currency. And human bodies, stinky, snoring, lice-infested bodies, were the only reliable heat source that didn't involve chopping down half the village forest. Sleeping arrangements weren't just random. This was medieval chess, warmth edition. The optimal sleeping configuration was designed like an onion. Layers. Kids in the middle. They had the least body mass and the most to lose. They were wrapped in the warmest spot, squished between parents or older siblings. Surrounding them, adults, preferably the warmer ones, usually those who did hard labor and came home radiating the kind of heat only desperation and 3-day-old wool undergarments could create. Elderly folks, often less tolerant to cold but more fragile, were positioned near the fire if there was one, though not too close. Open flames plus old bones and dry straw beds. Let's just say nobody wanted Grandma Flambe. The outermost layer, also, known as the frostbite frontier, was reserved for the unlucky, the outcasts, or whoever snored loudest last night. That was where cold seeped in, like a creeping shadow, slowly numbing fingers and dreams alike. You could almost hear winter whispering at your exposed toes. Just a nibble. No one wanted the edge. That was where you got the medieval version of an ice bath. But someone had to take it, and the rotation system was as much social diplomacy as it was survival. Did you skip chores today? To the edge you go. Did you spill the goat's milk? Edge. Did you steal someone's turn at the fire? Or complain too loudly about lice? That's right. Edge. Fairness wasn't just moral. It was thermal. Now imagine this scenario. 7 to 10 people, bundled in whatever cloth, fur, or straw-stuffed tunics they had, crammed onto a shared bedding surface made of wood, hay, and prayer. There's no mattress, no privacy, no scented candles. Just one long, low sleeping platform, or often just a stretch of straw-covered dirt floor, turned into a human lasagna of survival. One person shifts, the whole pile wiggles. Someone coughs, everyone gets the plague. Someone sneezes, you've got medieval glitter, moisture particles, and possible doom. It was not glamorous. It was not Instagrammable. but it was life-saving. Let's be clear. The average peasant didn't sleep with their family the way modern minds might joke about in Alabama memes. They slept next to their family, pressed so tightly together that personal space was a myth. Your sister's elbow was in your rib. Your cousin's foot was on your chest. Someone's hair was definitely in your mouth. But it didn't matter. At 10 degrees Celsius, love meant letting your brother drool on your forehead if it meant his body heat might warm your kidneys. And let's not forget, medieval people were not small. They were tough, muscular from labor, thick from wool layers they never took off, and occasionally armed with bedbugs. The stench was real. Sweat, livestock, feet, damp hay, and fermented clothing made for a sleep experience more pungent than peaceful. But no one complained. Complaining was for summer. Winter was for surviving. Some villages even had rituals around bedtime. You didn't just crawl in. You negotiated your spot. I was at the edge last night. But you have the thick cloak. Fine. We switch sides when the rooster crows. There were whispered arguments, passive-aggressive turns, and the occasional straw-poking revenge. If someone tried to steal heat without offering their own, they were called a cold thief. And in a society where trust and survival were bound together, being labeled one was a bigger scandal than stealing bread. The communal sleep tactic had unexpected psychological effects too. In this tight arrangement, families stayed close, literally and emotionally. You couldn't hide secrets when you shared a pillow woven from goat hair and ancestral disappointment. You heard each other's dreams, fears, prayers. Kids absorbed adult conversations. Parents absorbed every cough. Gossip wasn't whispered. It was lived in stereo. This pile of bodies became a feedback loop of breath and bonding. There were no doors to slam, no my room, my rules. The only walls were the ones you shivered against. And when someone died in the night, as sometimes happened, the absence of their body heat was noticed before their breath was. A creeping chill, where there had once been warmth, a stillness too still. Mourning in such settings was intimate, silent, and raw. Death didn't take people away. It left holes in the human pile. Some nights, people didn't even fully sleep. They dozed, half woke, adjusted the pile, listened to the fire crackle or a baby whimpering in its sleep. They reached for warmth in the dark without even thinking. Survival wasn't always heroic. Sometimes it was just instinctual, unconscious touch. And then the morning came. A rooster screamed. A goat stepped on someone's arm. People emerged, stiff, sweaty, covered in straw and family members, stretching out kinks that felt centuries old, groaning, picking lice, preparing to do it all again in 16 hours. Because winter wasn't going anywhere, and neither were they. So the next time you complain that your memory foam mattress isn't breathable, think of your medieval ancestors, sleeping 3 deep, nose to butt, under a fur stolen from a dead sheep, whispering prayers not for dreams, but for survival. Because in a world without central heating, the human body wasn't just a soul vessel. It was the blanket, the furnace, and the fragile shield between life and the frost. Forget your plush king-size mattress with the memory foam that cuddles your spine like a devoted golden retriever. Forget your 400 thread count sheets, your orthopedic pillows, even that weighted blanket you say helps with your anxiety. None of that would make sense to a medieval peasant, because if you asked them about their bed, they'd probably squint and reply, "You mean the pile of straw I sleep on that may or may not be hiding a rat?" In the winter depths of the Middle Ages, a bed was less a piece of furniture and more of a concept. If you were lucky, you might have a wooden frame, creaky, handmade, and leaning like it had survived a bar fight. But most peasants didn't get that luxury. What you got instead was a shallow pile of straw, hay, or whatever dry plant matter you hadn't already fed to your animals or burned for heat. This humble heap, lovingly infested with life and dust, became your nighttime haven. It was scratchy, it was pokey, it was flammable. and it was the only line between your freezing body and a stone-cold dirt floor that seemed to whisper, "Come closer. Let me drain the warmth from your bones." Straw wasn't chosen because it was soft. It wasn't. It was chosen because it was dry, accessible, and if layered thick enough, it kept your flesh from freezing to the ground like a medieval popsicle. It crackled with every movement. It held on to odors like your great-uncle's fishing vest. And most importantly, it housed an ecosystem. A full-blown society of fleas, mites, ticks, lice, spiders, and, on a good night, just a few beetles who'd gotten lost on their way to the pantry. Sleeping here wasn't rest. It was a nightly negotiation with nature. But still, it was better than nothing. Lying directly on the packed earth floor was like daring frostbite to a wrestling match. Dirt absorbed heat with terrifying efficiency. If you had nothing between your body and the ground, you were basically marinating in your own slow hypothermia. So straw, for all its sharp edges and surprise residence, was the lesser evil. It lifted you just enough, an inch, maybe two, to make a difference between shivering and shutting down. There were no blankets in the way we think of them. If you had an old cloak, great. If not, maybe a threadbare wool sheet passed down from your great-grandfather, smelling of age, damp, and defeat. Sometimes animal skins were used, still with the faint scent of goat or cow. But remember, those hides weren't tanned with today's chemicals. They were stiff, greasy, and occasionally still shedding. But at least they didn't bite. And sleep? Sleep wasn't the peaceful retreat we romanticize. It was a tactical maneuver, a survival drill. You didn't sprawl luxuriously or roll over at whim. You curled tightly, fetal style, to conserve heat. You spooned whoever was closest, parent, sibling, neighbor, even the dog, because a 102-degree mammal is a space heater you don't question. And you moved, constantly, not for comfort, but for circulation. Your limbs ached, your joints screamed, but lying too still meant blood pooled, toes froze, and fingers tingled with the creeping chill of something far more dangerous than discomfort. In this world, movement was medicine. Every toss and turn, every involuntary twitch was your body's desperate attempt to stay functional. Sometimes people woke with frost-nipped toes or stiff blue fingers. Sometimes they didn't wake at all. So families developed habits, pressing feet against another's thighs, tucking hands under armpits, rubbing calves like you were churning butter. Sleep wasn't rest. It was an activity. A full-body workout performed in darkness, silence, and hay. And the smell? Imagine damp wool, stale breath, urine, because yes, people sometimes relieved themselves indoors when it was too cold to go out, rotting straw, and the musky bouquet of unwashed humanity. Add a splash of goat. That was bedtime. Every inhalation, a gamble. Every sigh laced with texture. Your modern lavender diffuser would have passed out from shock. Let's not even get into the soundscape, between the wheezing snorers, the nighttime coughers, the straw's relentless rustling, and the occasional mouse sprinting across your collarbone. This was not a peaceful ambiance. More like a low-budget horror film scored by respiratory distress. And yet, people survived. They endured. Some even claim to have slept well, though we're pretty sure they meant didn't die. There was also the issue of pests. Lice were not occasional guests. They were roommates, permanent ones. Entire medieval medical tracts were written on the art of delousing, often involving vinegar, ash, and the sort of scratching that would get you kicked out of any modern yoga retreat. Your bed wasn't just a nest, it was a battlefield. Every night you fought the six-legged insurgents, and every morning you emerged either victorious or itchy. Yet despite all this, beds, if we can still call them that, were precious. The patch of straw you slept on was yours, marked by habit, warmed by repetition, flattened into a personal imprint of desperation. Some peasants added bits of old cloth, moss, even feathers if they'd been especially lucky, or found a dead bird. They layered, experimented, innovated. Anything to make the nest less hostile. And for all its flaws, that straw bed was still a refuge. A place to collapse after working in frozen fields. A corner to cry in when grief crept in, as it often did. A shared space to laugh, tell stories, or huddle against a howling wind. It wasn't glamorous, but it was something. Something to hold on to when the world outside threatened to swallow you in snow and sorrow. So tonight, when you fluff your pillows and adjust the thermostat, spare a thought for your ancestors, for the children curled in hay, for the mothers, whispering lullabies over lice-infested blankets, for the fathers snoring through toothless mouths as a spider explored their ear canal. They endured. They survived. They didn't have thread counts, but they had each other. And sometimes, in the coldest winters, that was just barely enough. If you've ever complained that your winter coat makes you look puffy, allow me to escort your attention to a 14th century peasant who would happily sell their only remaining tooth for that exact coat, puff and all. Because for them, fashion wasn't about turning heads. It was about keeping your head from freezing off. There were no aesthetics in peasant winter wear, unless you count surviving hypothermia as an aesthetic. Style was not a luxury. It was an afterthought. Or more accurately, it was a threat. Looking fashionable usually meant exposing skin. Showing off wrists or a neck was like sending a handwritten invitation to frostbite and pneumonia. So the goal wasn't to look good. The goal was to not look dead. Let's talk layers. Medieval peasants dressed for winter the way modern people. Pack for a 2-week trip, they'll somehow survive with a carry-on. You wore everything you owned. At once. That shirt your cousin gave you 5 years ago? It's on. The tunic you were buried in last year but somehow climbed out of. That too. 2 pairs of wool pants. 1 stolen, 1 inherited. A sack you cut a hole through because you thought it might be a cape? Welcome to the outfit. You didn't get dressed, so much as you built armor. 1 itchy, stiff, poorly dyed, vaguely scented layer at a time. And it didn't matter if the garments fit. Fashion wasn't about fit. Fashion was about fabric, any fabric. You wore socks as mittens, blankets as coats, dead animals as scarves. If it was thick, warmish, and didn't belong to someone stronger, then it became part of your ensemble. The result? A look best described as hobo onion, a being made entirely of layers, mystery, and the smell of old goat. Now let's address texture. Most clothes were wool, not the soft, brushed, Italian spun cashmere you're thinking of. No. This was wool that had been washed maybe once, chewed on by something, mended with twine, and soaked in sweat, rain, and the tears of the person wearing it. It was heavy. It was stiff. It chafed like a medieval ex-wife. But it trapped heat, and that's all that mattered. For insulation, people also relied on what modern science might call natural barriers. Things like dirt, oil, old food stains. That's right. Dirty clothes were warmer. The filth acted as a windbreaker. So while you're doing your 6th load of laundry this week, remember, medieval peasants survived the winter by becoming human. Compost piles. If you smelled clean, people assumed you were rich, or recently dead. But the real prize in peasant couture? Goat hair. Specifically, thick, coarse, unprocessed goat hair woven into cloaks and jackets. Not only did it block wind and rain, kind of, but it also made you look like you'd lost a bet with evolution. You itched, constantly, but you didn't freeze. Small win. And if anyone thought you smelled bad, you could always say, "Oh, that's just the goat," and pretend you weren't crying on the inside. Scarves? Yes. Peasants had those too, though scarf might be too generous. They were more like ragged strips of cloth wrapped around the face like some medieval version of a ski mask. It wasn't for style. It was for survival. The air was so cold, it could sear your lungs, so you covered your mouth and nose not to look mysterious, but to stay alive. And just like that, every peasant became an unwilling ninja, a frostbitten, hacking, coughing ninja with lice. But these rags did more than keep you warm. They also acted as filters for the soot and smoke that lingered in every home like an uninvited uncle. Breathing through cloth helped avoid choking on your own fireplace, which, if you've seen part 4 of this series, you'll know was less fireplace and more smoke dispenser. As for color schemes, don't even ask. There was no concept of earth tones or pops of color. Everything was brown, or gray, or brownish gray. Why? Because dyes cost money, and peasants didn't have money. They barely had socks. You didn't dress to impress. You dressed to compress. To wrap your shivering limbs in as many depressing shades of misery as possible. Shoes? If you had them, they were made of rough leather, often handed down for so many generations they had more family history than you did. Soles were thin, seams were broken, and waterproofing was a myth. So people stuffed them with straw or moss, or worse, wore nothing. Barefoot, in winter, through snow. Because what are toes, really, except nature's most disposable feature? But perhaps the most tragicomic part of medieval fashion was the social hierarchy of warmth. The rich had furs, real furs, lined cloaks, velvet tunics, sable-trimmed hoods. The poor had dreams. And occasionally, those dreams were made of potato sacks. You could literally identify someone's class by how many holes were in their outfit, and how much frost had claimed their ears. And yet, within this frost-bitten fabric apocalypse, there was pride. Pride in not shivering to death. Pride in being able to patch your own tunic. Pride in surviving the night without waking up with a rat in your trousers. Your clothes were proof of life. Worn, stitched, frayed, and fierce. Each tear had a story. Each stain had a memory, and each layer was a middle finger to the cold. So the next time you complain that your jacket makes you look like a marshmallow, remember this. Looking like a marshmallow is infinitely better than being a corpse cycle in a burlap toga. Fashion in the Middle Ages wasn't a choice. It was a weapon. And the best dressed? They were simply the ones still breathing. In the modern world, food is passion, aesthetic, a culture, a love language. But for a medieval peasant bracing for the annual assault of winter, food wasn't poetry. It was ammunition. A peasant didn't eat for pleasure. They ate to fight. Every bite was a calorie, and every calorie was a desperate little soldier sent to defend the body from the merciless siege of the cold. Let's get one thing clear. Calories were gold. You weren't counting them. You were hunting them, hoarding them, praying to every saint, real or imaginary, that your bowl of soup had just enough fat in it to keep your liver from staging a revolt. There were no keto diets, no carb avoidance. Carbs were life. Carbs were heat. Your body was a furnace, and without fuel, that fire went out, and so did you. Breakfast, if you were lucky enough to eat it, wasn't some Pinterest-worthy affair with avocado toast and lavender oat milk. No, it was hot water that had been near, a turnip. Or maybe a heel of bread so hard you could use it to defend your home. Protein? Only if your neighbor died and left behind a pig. Sugar? The closest you came to that was imagining what honey used to taste like before your teeth fell out. But then came the MVP of medieval winter dining, the eternal root vegetable. Radishes, turnips, beets, rutabagas, anything that came from the stem, ground, and could survive the frost longer than your will to live was on the menu. And when boiled long enough, like say, 2 days, they technically became soup. Soup, here being a generous term for a thick, steamy potion that smelled like boiled sadness, but at least kept you warm enough not to hallucinate. Now, let's talk meat. Or rather, let's talk the idea of meat. Because real, fresh meat in winter? That was unicorn tier fantasy. You had salted meat. Cured, smoked, dried, brined, whatever it took to keep it from becoming a biohazard before February. This was meat. that had been processed more than your emotions. Pork fat was gold, bacon was sacred, and salted beef? That was the chewy brick your soul clung to in the dark months. Flavorful? No. Edible? Barely. Survival fuel? Absolutely. Of course, preserving meat wasn't just about flavor. It was about not dying from your food. Medieval winter was a tightrope. Walk between starvation and food poisoning. Eat too little? Freeze. Eat something that's a little off? Die in a puddle of your own regrets. You learn to trust your nose, your instincts, and the family pig more than the weather forecast. Now, stew. That was where the culinary magic happened. Not magic in the Disney sense, more like black magic. A peasant stew could contain anything. Barley, beans, onions, bones, moss, stale ale, maybe a surprise beetle or two. You simmered it for hours, maybe days, reheating and reboiling it until the water became thick and brown and nutritionally ambiguous. But it was hot. It went down warm. It filled your stomach. And on some days, that was enough to convince your body not to give up. And let's not forget gruel, the humble, often hated, yet utterly essential gruel. It wasn't food so much as edible temperature. A bowl of gruel in the morning meant your internal organs got at least one shot at warming up before they iced over again. Made from oats, wheat, rye, whatever grains you hadn't already fed to your one remaining chicken, gruel was cheap, filling, and endlessly depressing. But it worked. And in winter, working was the only cuisine standard that mattered. Drinks? There was ale. Weak ale, peasant ale. Not for getting drunk, but for staying hydrated without gambling your kidneys on cholera. Water was a dice roll in the Middle Ages. But ale, fermented, purified, warmish. You'd drink it all day, at breakfast with soup before bed. Not for fun, but because beer didn't kill you. Unless you drowned in it, which in winter sounded better than freezing. Now, eating wasn't just a meal. It was a ritual. A chance to gather around the fire, or what passed for a fire, and inhale something vaguely edible while pretending your nose wasn't dripping on your spoon. Every warm meal was a small act of defiance. You didn't just eat. You asserted your right to exist, to generate heat, to stay another day ahead of the frost. And the most glorious part of this sad little survival banquet? Falling asleep on a full stomach. You see, in medieval winter, hunger was the cousin of death. A grumbling belly wasn't just annoying, it meant your body was running on fumes. So when you managed to stuff yourself with enough boiled root paste and pork rind to quiet your insides, you could sleep like a log. Not comfortably, not without waking up sore and covered in bugs, but at least warm, full bellies insulated from the inside. Hunger made you cold. Fullness gave you one more degree of life. It's no wonder that across medieval folklore, winter spirits and demons often came with hunger as their herald. Starving people didn't hallucinate. They saw things. They dreamed of feasts, banquets, roasted beasts with golden skin and juicy fat. And then they woke up next to a pot of turnip slop and cried into it, one teardrop at a time. So the next time you heat up leftovers and feel sad they're not from DoorDash, think about the peasant trying to chew through a salted ox ankle at midnight, praying it had enough calories to keep their liver operational. Food wasn't a joy. It wasn't an indulgence. It wasn't even a choice. It was fuel. Desperate, gritty, earthy fuel to keep you vertical one more day. And that, dear viewer, is how you eat not to enjoy, not to indulge, but to not die. Bon appétit, 14th century style. Let's talk about breathing. Something so automatic, so fundamental you probably never think about it. But in a medieval winter, thinking about your breath could be the line between being cold and being dead. That frosty inhale wasn't just refreshing, like an overpriced spa. No, it was a straight-up invitation to pneumonia, lung rot, and the kind of cough that makes your ribs feel like gravel. One wrong breath in January, and the village priest was measuring you for a box. Now, to survive the unforgiving chill of the medieval air, peasants didn't just walk around mouth-breathing like background characters in a zombie film. No, mouth breathing was for amateurs, for people who wanted their lungs flash-frozen like bad leftovers. Nose breathing? That was your first line of defense. Your sinuses were the medieval version of a heating system. Basic, underfunded, but doing its damnedest. Breathing through the nose did something magical. It warmed the air slightly before it hit your lungs. Not enough to make it cozy, but enough to prevent your bronchi from seizing up like rusted door hinges. And in a world where a simple cold could turn into your final goodbye, you treated every breath like a tactical maneuver. Your lungs weren't just organs. They were the battlefield. Every inhale a gamble, every exhale a victory, but wait, it gets more ridiculous. Because when your breath starts to crystallize on your lips, dripping down your chin like frozen regret, what do? You wrap a cloth around your face. Enter the medieval multi-tool, a scarf, a veil, a rag, a strip of old underpants if it came to that. This humble piece of fabric wasn't about fashion. It was about survival. It turned your face into a self-sustaining microclimate. Your hot breath cycled in and out like a DIY humidifier, except it smelled like pickled onion soup and despair. These mouth coverings weren't optional. If you stepped outside in January without one, you could feel your soul start to stiffen. It was the medieval equivalent of walking into an open freezer naked. People didn't just cover their mouths. They covered their very will to live. But the problem was, by morning, that little scrap of cloth would be soaked, frozen solid, icy on the outside, damp on the inside, like some kind of haunted lasagna. And yet, you still wrapped it back around your face the next day because it was better than inhaling razors. Now let's talk about that first breath of the day. Picture this. You've made it through the night. Your straw bed is stiff, your toes are number than your moral compass, and you sit up to greet the sun, or rather, the gray sadness that passes for dawn in January. And the first thing that hits you? Not joy, not light, but a face full of frigid air that slices through your sinuses and whispers, "You still alive? Let's fix that." Peasants developed a kind of rhythm to their breathing, shallow, controlled, as if the very act of taking in too much air would anger the cold gods. And sometimes it worked. Other times your breath would fog up around your face, forming a halo of failure. The real pros, those grizzled winter veterans, learned how to sip the air, not gulp it, to hold it a little longer, to trap it behind a cloth. Every breath was measured, earned. It wasn't just about the lungs either. It was about energy. Shivering takes calories. Deep breathing takes effort. And effort takes food, which, as we've established, was already in short supply. So you couldn't afford to breathe too hard. You had to make every puff of breath count. Get in, get out. No drama. But sometimes, you didn't get to choose. You caught a cold. Or worse, the cold caught you. Then came the cough, the chesty, hacking, soul-rattling cough that echoed through the hut like a war drum. Everyone else around. The fire would lean slightly away, trying not to inhale your fate. Because everyone knew. Once your lungs started leaking, it was over. You were on borrowed time. Medieval medicine had no antibiotics, no Vicks VapoRub, no steaming showers or nebulizers. If you were lucky, someone would hand you a boiled onion and mutter a half-remembered prayer from a saint with a name like Saint Phlegmus the Merciful. Otherwise, you coughed, you bled, you hoped. So keeping that breath warm, keeping it moist, keeping it flowing through your nose rather than straight into your bronchial tubes like ice arrows. That was survival strategy. 101. Your body didn't just need warmth from the outside. It needed internal fire. And your breath? That was the bellows keeping the flame alive. And then there was the group breathing. Inside cramped huts where 10 people and 5 animals shared one fire and 0 personal space, the air got interesting. You were inhaling more of your cousin's exhaled goat breath than actual oxygen. But weirdly enough, that helped. Warm air is warm air, even if it smells like fermented cabbage and chicken dandruff. In these spaces, breath was communal. People learned to sleep in sync, breathe in rhythm, share their warmth and their wheezing. Sometimes you could hear the whole family exhaling at once. A soft whoosh, like the house itself sighing under the weight of not being dead. And yes, you'd get used to it. That earthy stink, that mist of breath that hung low like ghost fog, that sound of someone snoring through frostbitten nostrils, it became the soundtrack of survival. Because in a medieval winter, there were no inspirational speeches. No cinematic music, just breath. Shaky, careful, dogged breath. In, out, in, out. The most primal rhythm in the world. And every time you managed another round, you hadn't just survived the night. You'd defied it. So the next time you pull, your hoodie tight and complain that it's a bit chilly when the thermostat dips below 70, take a moment to imagine that cold being inside your lungs, curling into your ribs, scraping your windpipe with invisible ice knives. And then, thank your nose, hug your scarf, and whisper a thank you to your central heating system. Because once upon a time, breathing was an extreme sport, and the medal for winning was not dying. In the medieval world, sleeping through the night was as mythical as dragons with good dental hygiene. You didn't just go to bed, snore peacefully, and wake up to birdsong and sourdough. No, sleep was a high-stakes negotiation with frostbite, hypothermia, and the ever-hungry cold that slipped through cracks like a stalker with unfinished business. Because here's the hard truth. Fire didn't feed itself. And if no one got up to tend the embers, those embers died. And then, well, so did you. So welcome to the shift life. Everyone in the house, kids, parents, grandma with one working, eye and half a hip, took turns watching the fire. This wasn't a cozy campfire story moment. This was a tactical, coordinated survival rotation where every hour mattered. If the fire died out at 3 a.m., you might not wake up at all. Not because someone killed you, but because the weather did. Quietly, efficiently, without flair. Think of it like a medieval night shift. Except your clock-in was usually a tap on the shoulder from a freezing sibling, and your uniform was 3 layers of lice-infested wool. Your job? Poke the fire. Add fuel. Not fall asleep. Don't catch fire yourself. And maybe mutter a few prayers to whatever saint handled not dying horribly in winter, if one existed. Now let's talk about what tending that fire actually meant. There were no lighters. No fire starter logs dipped in petroleum. What you had was a dull iron poker, damp logs, and hope. You sat near the hearth, eyes barely open, toes numb, watching for signs of collapse. Was the flame flickering? Was the coal bed glowing? Did it smell too much like smoke and not enough like salvation? You had to read the fire like it was a moody spouse, anticipate its needs, feed it gently, and for the love of all that was warm, don't smother it. If you were lucky, your shift passed with no surprises. But lucky was rare. More likely, you fought sleep like a gladiator in a dream arena. Your head bobbed, your body shook. And just when your eyelids betrayed you, a log would crack or spit a spark that brought you jerking back to the land of the barely alive. Some folks even chewed herbs to stay alert. Bitter roots, pungent leaves, anything to keep their brains from going offline and taking the fire with them. And here's the kicker. Even the kids weren't spared. If you were old enough to walk, you were old enough to sit by the fire and make sure your siblings didn't freeze. Childhood was not a protected bubble of cartoons and nap time. It was boot camp with less food. Little hands would drag logs toward the hearth. bleary eyes scanning the coals like tiny soldiers guarding the last flicker of hope. And the worst part? No one questioned it. It was just part of growing up. Want to learn responsibility? Forget chores. Keep the family alive until sunrise. Sometimes, whole families developed rituals around these shifts. A whispered prayer before starting. A special log they saved for the coldest hours. A secret stash of kindling tucked behind the goats. There was always a goat. Or 5. The firekeeper wasn't just a guardian of warmth. They were a sentinel standing between the family and the jaws of winter. If the fire flickered too low, panic set in fast. The room got colder in seconds, as if the walls themselves were rooting for your failure. The air thickened. The baby started coughing. Grandma muttered in her sleep. You scrambled, threw on more wood, dry, wet, it didn't matter, and prayed it would catch. Because if it didn't, you'd have to wake the others. And that was the nuclear option. Waking up the household for a fire emergency guaranteed a mix of panic, yelling, and blame so intense it could melt snow. Just not fast enough. But the flip side, the quiet power of the successful shift. That moment at 4 a.m., when the fire glows strong and steady, and your family sleeps soundly, wrapped in rags and borrowed body heat. You feel like a warrior, a silent hero in a saga no one will ever sing about. You kept the cold out for one more night, and in that moment, despite the smoke in your eyes and the ache in your bones, you're proud. No one bragged about these shifts. They weren't glamorous. They left you with soot in your teeth and burn holes in your sleeves. But they were necessary. And more importantly, they were shared. Everyone suffered. Everyone participated. Even the village drunk got a turn, assuming. He wasn't passed out in the hay. This communal rhythm of waking, watching, sleeping in chunks, it rewired your brain. You lived in fragments. 3 hours on, 3 off, no REM, just survival mode sleep interrupted by duty. The result? A population perpetually sleep-deprived, permanently grumpy, and understandably obsessed with fire. And what did they dream of during those stolen naps? Not riches, not adventure, but sleep. Deep, uninterrupted, oblivious sleep. The kind that doesn't come with the threat of frostbite or flaming accidents. It was a fantasy as far-fetched as dragons. Today, we chase productivity hacks. Back then, they chased warmth. And the key to it all was vigilance. Fire wasn't luxury. It was life support. The firekeeper wasn't romantic. They were exhausted, charred, revered in the way only someone who prevents your death without asking for thanks can be. So the next time you think you're tired, consider this. No one in your house has to wake up at 2 a.m. to keep the furnace from murdering you. No 7-year-old is being shaken awake to guard a pile of embers while everyone else sleeps. You live in a world where sleep is optional, not tactical. The medieval peasant? They slept in shifts, staggered, exhausted, because fire never slept, and neither could they. Picture this. You wake up in the middle of the night because something's dripping on your forehead. Is it water? Is it rat pee? Is it regret? No time to philosophize, because the wind just howled through a crack in your wall, wide enough to host a family of ghosts. Welcome to medieval homeownership, where every winter night is a slap in the way, face from Mother Nature with a frozen fish. Here, home repair wasn't about improving property value. It was a last-ditch attempt to not become part of the landscape by spring. Let's start with the golden rule of medieval winter maintenance. If it has a hole, stuff it with something, anything. That something could be old cloth, straw, moss, or even human hair. Yes, really. If you brushed your hair and it didn't go into your next scarf or pillow, it probably ended up in your wall. Medieval draft-proofing didn't care about your aesthetic. Drafts were not just inconvenient. They were death threats delivered in icy whispers. So if it blocked the wind, it was in. And if it smelled like goat, even better. It meant it was authentic. Walls were like patchwork quilts, except made from filth and fear. You patched them again and again, layering over old repairs like sediment in an archaeological dig of desperation. If you lived long enough, your house started to smell more like survival than shelter. Every layer added insulation, and every layer absorbed moisture, rot, and the occasional insect colony. But who cared? It held. That was the win. Now let's talk about the MVP of winter insulation. Cow dung, or horse dung, or sheep dung. If it pooped and had body heat, it had potential. Dung wasn't just waste. It was winter's flex tape. You'd mix it with straw into a sticky slurry, slap it on the wall like brown frosting on a moldy cake, and wait for it to dry. Once hardened, it acted like medieval drywall, but with aroma. This wasn't just effective, it was cultural. You grew up with the smell. It was your childhood, your grandmother's hug, and your existential crisis all wrapped in one pungent whiff. But that sacred wall poo blend wasn't eternal. Snow and rain wore it down. Rodents nibbled at it. Kids poked it out of boredom, which meant you had to keep applying fresh layers. And if you were out of dung, well, time to get collecting. Winter home repair meant shoveling poop while your fingers went numb, just to keep the frostbite away a little longer. And nobody was exempt. Men, women, children, everyone patched, smeared, stuffed, and gagged together. As if that wasn't enough of a nightmare. Let's talk about resource wars. No, not oil, straw. Every household needed it, not just for bedding or feeding livestock, but for plugging the 1,000 little holes that kept forming as your walls slowly fell apart. In some villages, straw was more valuable than food. Fights broke out. People hoarded it. Accusations of theft flew across freezing air like snowflakes. If your neighbor's house suddenly looked too draft-free, you looked at them differently. Like, nice insulation, Gregory. Shame if someone coughed on it. In truly desperate times, folks used whatever they could find. Shredded clothes, bark, leftover wool, feathers, even old shoes. There are accounts of people cutting their only tunic into strips to seal a gap in the wall. Because what's the point of wearing a tunic if you're frozen solid inside your own home? Priorities had to shift. Warmth first, dignity second, fashion extinct. And then there was the roof. Thatch was notoriously leak-prone, especially under snow. It sagged, collapsed, or turned into a slippery death trap. So you repaired it, over and over, risking your life on a rickety ladder made of gilt and splinters. One hand to hold on, the other to slam more dung and straw into place, as if daring the blizzard to do its worst. Spoiler, it usually did. None of this was optional. Winter didn't care if you were tired, didn't care if your back hurt, didn't care if your only blanket had frozen solid and your toes were going purple. You patched or you perished. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't rustic. It was real-life Hunger Games with cow dung, and don't think this was a one-and-done effort in November. No, winter was long, miserable, and persistent. By February, your home looked like it had survived a siege, because it had. The siege of cold. Every week brought a new breach, a new draft, a new curse muttered through chattering teeth. It was maintenance as warfare. You weren't improving your home. You were fighting back. With poop, straw, spit, and spite. So yes, in the modern world, your heating bill sucks. Your roof leaks? That's annoying. Your landlord won't fix the mold in the ceiling? Call him out, please. But just for a moment, be glad that you're not crawling around in the snow at 3 a.m. smearing goat dung on your wall to stop your child from freezing to death. Be thankful you don't need to choose between burning your last pair of boots or wearing them to your own funeral. Because medieval winter repairs weren't just chores. They were lifelines, stitched together with desperation and dirt. And if your wall held until spring, that wasn't luck. That was hard, filthy, relentless work. So here's to the patchers, the dung slingers, the menders of broken roofs and frozen dreams. They didn't get credit. They didn't get clean. But damn it, they got through. In a world where central heating hadn't even been invented in imagination yet, where the idea of thermostats belonged to wizards or lunatics, there existed a daily fight not to freeze to death in your own home. And by home, we mean the drafty mud and wattle approximation of shelter you shared with livestock and occasionally, hope. So how did people in medieval Europe survive nights that could turn boiling water to ice in seconds? They did it with rocks. Literal rocks. Heated in the fire, wrapped in cloth, and tucked in like the world's least cuddly teddy bear. This wasn't some cozy Pinterest idea. This was pain management. This was necessity weaponized. Because if you didn't have a glowing ember under your blanket, or more accurately, your burlap sack that dreamed of being a blanket, you weren't just a little chilly. You were negotiating with hypothermia every night. That's where the ancient art of hot rock therapy came in, medieval peasant edition. Let's set the scene. You're done with a long day of shoveling frozen manure, grinding stale grains, and contemplating whether this is the year a local lord might tax the warmth out of your soul. Your fingers are numb. Your nose is a leaky icicle. But there, in the center of your dirt floor hut, is your one loyal friend, the hearth. And nestled in those coals is your salvation, a rock. Not just any rock, a stone selected for its ability to hold heat like it owes you money. You pull it out carefully, because this is the part where you either get warm or get third-degree burns. Wrap it in layers of fabric. Not fresh linens, mind you. Who the hell has those? More like an old shirt that once belonged to your dead uncle and now smells like if mildew had an armpit. You clutch that fabric-wrapped stone to your chest, or wedge it into your straw bed, and wait for the magic to happen. And by magic, we mean basic thermal retention. Your bed slowly thaws from corpse slab to not actively killing you. And if you're lucky, you get a few hours of sleep without your teeth chattering like haunted wind chimes. Of course, like all great things in medieval life, there's a catch. If you misjudge the heat, or you get cocky and skip the cloth wrap, you wake up with a rock-shaped brand seared into your thigh. A peasant's tattoo, if you will. It says, "I tried to be warm and paid in flesh." But many took the risk because the alternative was a slow, frostbitten fade into oblivion. Now, hot rocks were good for sleeping, but what about eating? That's where the haybox came in. Imagine, if you will, a slow cooker powered by physics and desperation. The haybox wasn't a fancy wooden crate with buttons and timers. It was a literal box, filled with straw or hay, that held a boiling pot of soup or stew, long enough for it to finish cooking without wasting precious firewood. Firewood, by the way, which took hours to chop, days to dry, and could double as currency. When things got bleak. Which, spoiler, they were always bleak. Here's how it worked. You get your pot boiling over the fire, hopefully with something edible inside, turnips, salt, and the occasional rodent if you're lucky. Then you nestle it deep into a cocoon of hay, trapping the heat like it owes you rent. The haybox didn't make food better. It didn't make it tastier. But it made it possible. Possible to cook without dying of smoke inhalation or burning through your winter's supply of fuel. Possible to leave it alone and go shovel snow off your thatched roof before it collapses onto your sleeping children. The science is simple. Insulation slows heat loss. Hay traps the warmth, lets the pot keep cooking gently, like a medieval sous vide with a personality disorder. The food inside could stay piping hot for hours. Not gourmet, but not frozen solid either. Which, in the context of medieval survival, was Michelin star success. Still, the haybox came with hazards of its own. Leave it too long, you risk spoiled food. Nestle it too close to the embers, you risk lighting your house on fire. Miscalculate the hay-to-pot ratio and congratulations, you've invented flavorless sludge that might still kill you. But get it right, And you had a warm meal and heat-retained leftovers that might just get you through another 12-hour night in a home that whispered death through its walls. There's something hauntingly beautiful about the whole system, using nature, stones and hay, to push back against nature's cruelty. You could almost say it was poetic, if it didn't reek of burnt straw, old socks, and boiled cabbage. This was innovation born of suffering, not science. The kind of creativity you get when the question isn't, what can I build, but what can I do so I don't die tonight? And yet, it worked. For centuries. Before radiators and insulation foam and electric blankets, there was fire. Then there were rocks. Then there was hay. And in those humble, itchy, sooty tools, there was a lifeline. A way to trick the cold for just one more night. That was all they needed. One more night. Then another. Until spring. So next time you microwave your soup or crank your thermostat from the comfort of your memory foam bed, remember this. Some ancestor of yours once stayed alive by hugging a rock and burying their dinner in straw. And they did it with a kind of stubborn grace that modern comfort will never replicate. They didn't have a choice. And somehow, that made them brilliant. When you think about surviving winter, you probably imagine firewood, blankets, or hot soup. What you probably don't imagine is a half-frozen peasant croaking out Latin hymns with chilblains on their toes and steam coming out of their mouth. Not from the heat, but from the fact that the church is so cold it could double as a meat locker. Welcome to the medieval version of winter resilience. Prayer, and not the cute, God bless this home kind. We're talking survival chants, thermodynamic hymns, the kind of musical desperation that says, Dear Lord, please just don't let my snot freeze before Mass ends. Churches in the Middle Ages were, let's say, architecturally ambitious but practically indifferent. High ceilings, stone walls, no insulation whatsoever. Perfect for acoustics, horrible for human survival. And yet, this is where people gathered, sometimes daily, sometimes several times a day, to pray, sing, and try not to become ecclesiastical popsicles. These weren't optional community concerts either. In a world where famine, plague, and being accused of witchcraft could ruin your week, attending Mass wasn't just piety, it was insurance. It was networking. And maybe, just maybe, God might grant you one more sunrise. Now imagine this. It's dawn. It's snowing. The wind is howling like it's auditioning for a horror movie. And the bell rings. Time for matins. You, still wrapped in whatever semi-warm rags passed for sleepwear, have to drag your shivering self to a church that feels colder inside than outside. And there, around a sputtering candle or two, stands your community, breathing out fog and singing psalms in unison, the sound echoing through the frozen nave like a ghostly protest against the cold. It's tragic. It's beautiful. It's insane. It's medieval winter. Singing wasn't just a religious obligation. It was body heat coordination. You sang to stay warm, to move air through your lungs, to keep your soul from giving up. In the most literal sense, choirs were thermal resistance. Every note was a flutter of heat, every harmony a moment of shared humanity, and every missed pitch a reminder that Sister Agnes probably should have stuck to chanting. You weren't just singing to God. You were singing to yourself, to your neighbors, to the frost creeping down the altar steps. A kind of holy defiance. If we're going to freeze, at least we'll freeze in harmony. And then there were the prayers. The Latin chants, the whispered petitions, the muttered, please no frostbite today, appeals to saints whose job descriptions had long been expanded to include hypothermia management. These prayers filled the cold like fog fills a valley, thick with hope, desperation, superstition, and occasionally, pure sarcasm. You prayed for warmth, yes, but also for the strength to endure the cold, because warmth wasn't promised. Ever. But endurance, that you could at least pretend to control. The altar might be lit, but only barely. The candles were thin, flickering, doing their best to not die out mid-sermon. The priest's breath came out in puffs. You couldn't see his hands under the layers of cloth, and frankly, you were too focused on your own frozen fingers to care whether the sermon was about sin, salvation, or simply not dying in the next 48 hours. And still, everyone stood there. Faith wasn't just a virtue, it was insulation. The belief that this misery meant something kept the people from giving up. If not heat, they had hope. And that hope burned in a way no hearth could. Sometimes, the only thing louder than the prayers were the coughs. If you've never heard a congregation with winter bronchitis sing Kyrie Ellison, you haven't lived. Or maybe they haven't lived. Either way, it was part musical, part medical, drama. These were not angelic choirs. These were the phlegm-fueled warriors of liturgical survival. Children sniffling, elders wheezing, someone always faintly mumbling the wrong line, but nobody had the energy to correct them. This was not Broadway. This was battlefield. The location mattered too. Being near the altar, warmer. Being near the back, good luck. Being close to the side wall, might as well pray for a quick afterlife. Strategic placement became a passive-aggressive art form. Arrive early, get a warmer spot. Arrive late, and you were in the draft zone, the place where even the saints wouldn't sit. And God help you if you had to kneel. Cold stone on bare knees was less penitence and more torture ritual. The spiritual warmth wasn't metaphorical. It had to do the job of actual warmth. People clung to scripture like it was a blanket. They wrapped themselves in belief when wool failed. The fire of faith, they called it. And when you've got no fireplace and no thick clothing, you'd be surprised how much comfort you can extract from a Bible verse, or at least how much distraction. Let's not romanticize this. It wasn't always noble. There was plenty of muttering under the breath, plenty of, "Why are we doing this again?" Looks exchanged during particularly long services. Faith was powerful, yes, but so was frostbite. And sometimes the line between devout and desperate blurred into one another. Still, the act of coming together, standing, singing, shivering in unison, created a bond. A warmth that wasn't thermal, but tribal. A reminder. We're cold, we're miserable, but we're not alone. And then there was the unspoken rule. Don't steal firewood, especially not from the church. Because nothing sours a prayer faster than realizing your neighbor snuck in and stole the last dry log while you were on your knees asking God to smite the cold. Even faith had boundaries. Respect the fire, respect the freeze. And whatever you do, don't try to heat the place with candlelight alone unless you want to wake up with your eyebrows singed off. So yes, medieval winter worship was brutal, but in its own strange way, it was also beautiful. Not because it was comfortable, but because it was communal. Because the cold didn't care about your social class, but the choir did. Because shared breath and broken voices stitched a community together tighter than any cloak. Because sometimes you just had to laugh at the absurdity of it all, cough up some phlegm, and belt out another hymn, louder than the wind howling through the nave. And maybe, just maybe, that's what kept them warm. Not the fire, not the furs, but the sheer audacity of hope wrapped in melody, and the radical belief that even in the coldest hour, someone or something was listening. In the unforgiving grip of medieval winter, survival wasn't a solitary endeavor. It was a collective mission. The village wasn't just a cluster of dwellings. It was a living organism, pulsating with shared warmth, mutual aid, and the unspoken understanding that unity was the only path through the cold. Shared flames. The hearth of community. In an era devoid of central heating, the communal fire became the nucleus of village life. Families gathered around shared hearths, not only to cook and eat, but to exchange stories, news, and warmth. The fire was more than a physical necessity. It was a symbol of togetherness, a beacon in the bleakness of winter. The proximity to the fire often reflected social hierarchies, with elders and leaders occupying the warmest spots, while others found their place in the periphery, yet all were part of the circle. Guardians of the flame, the Elder Watch elders, held a revered position as the custodians of the communal fire. Their experience and wisdom were invaluable in maintaining the delicate balance of fuel and flame. They orchestrated the collection of firewood, ensuring that the fire burned steadily through the night. Their vigilance was a silent promise to the village, a pledge that the warmth would persist, that the darkness would not prevail. Disputes and diplomacy, the heat of conflict. In the close quarters of village life, conflicts were inevitable. Disagreements over resources, responsibilities, or personal grievances could ignite tensions. However, these disputes were often tempered by the overarching need for cooperation. The community understood that survival hinged on unity. Thus, conflicts were addressed through dialogue and compromise, with the collective well-being taking precedence over individual pride. The fabric of mutual aid. The village operated on a system of mutual aid, where labor and resources were shared for the common good. Tasks such as repairing homes, tending to the sick, or assisting with childbirth were communal responsibilities. This network of support ensured that no individual faced the harshness of winter alone. The strength of the village lay in its interdependence, in the understanding that each person's welfare was intrinsically linked to that of their neighbors. Conclusion: the enduring legacy of communal resilience. The medieval village exemplified the power of collective resilience. In the face of adversity, it was the bonds of community that provided the strength to endure. The shared fire, the mutual support, the resolution of conflicts, all these elements wove a tapestry of survival that transcended the individual. The legacy of these communal practices endures, reminding us that in unity lies our greatest strength against the coldest of challenges. In the heart of a medieval winter, despite every precaution, preparation, and prayer, there were times when the cold proved insurmountable. Villages, once bustling with life and camaraderie, could become eerily silent, blanketed not just by snow, but by the stillness of lives extinguished. This chapter delves into those harrowing instances when, despite communal fires, shared resources, and unwavering spirit, entire communities succumbed to the relentless grip of winter. The chronicles of history, though often silent on such tragedies, hint at villages where the hearths went cold and the songs ceased. Archaeological findings have unearthed settlements where daily life abruptly halted, suggesting that the inhabitants faced a catastrophe they couldn't overcome. In some cases, the absence of struggle or signs of conflict points to a quiet end, where the cold claimed lives without resistance, leaving behind a frozen tableau of a community that once thrived. These silent passings were devoid of the drama often associated with disaster. There were no cries for help echoing through the night, no frantic attempts to seek aid. Instead, there was a gradual fading, as individuals, weakened by hunger and cold, slipped into eternal slumber. Snow gently covered their still forms, preserving the final moments of a life lived in harmony with nature, yet ultimately at its mercy. The reasons for such total losses were manifold. A failed harvest could deplete food stores, while an unexpected early frost might catch a village unprepared. Diseases, exacerbated by malnutrition and close quarters, could spread rapidly, leaving little time for response. In some instances, external factors like raids or political turmoil disrupted supply lines, isolating communities during their most vulnerable times. Yet, from these tragedies arose lessons that resonated through generations. Surviving neighboring villages would often take heed, adjusting their practices to avoid similar fates. Stories of lost communities became cautionary tales, emphasizing the importance of preparation, diversification of resources, and the need for alliances beyond one's immediate vicinity. These narratives, though born of sorrow, fortified the resolve of others to persevere. In modern times, the echoes of these silent winters serve as a poignant reminder of humanity's vulnerability and resilience. They underscore the importance of community, preparation, and adaptability. While today's challenges differ in nature, the essence remains. In unity and foresight lies the strength to weather any storm. In the annals of history, the tales of those who braved the unforgiving winters of the medieval era stand as testaments to human resilience. These were not stories of grand conquests or noble quests, but of ordinary individuals who, armed with sheer determination and communal bonds, faced the relentless cold. Their legacy is etched not in monuments, but in the very fabric of survival, strategies passed down through generations. The medieval winter was a formidable adversary. With limited resources and rudimentary shelter, communities relied heavily on collective effort. The communal hearth became the heart of the village, offering warmth and a place for shared stories and songs. Elders, revered for their wisdom, guided the younger members in preparing for the harsh months, emphasizing the importance of stockpiling food and insulating homes. Yet, despite meticulous preparations, nature's fury was unpredictable. There were times when all efforts seemed in vain. Villages would fall silent, not from defeat, but from the weight of snow-laden roofs and the stillness of frostbitten fields. These moments, though tragic, were not in vain. They served as poignant reminders of the delicate balance between humanity and nature. From these experiences emerged invaluable lessons: the importance of community solidarity, the necessity of adapting to environmental changes, and the resilience to rebuild after devastation became ingrained in the collective consciousness. These principles transcended generations, influencing practices and traditions that persist even today. In our modern era, with the comfort of central heating and insulated homes, it's easy to overlook the struggles of our ancestors. However, every time we gather around a fireplace or share a meal during winter, we echo the practices of those who came before us. Their stories, though perhaps not widely known, live on in these simple acts. So, as we wrap ourselves in warm blankets and sip hot beverages, let us take a moment to honor the legacy of the stubborn, the individuals who, through grit and unity, faced the harshest of winters and laid the foundation for the comforts we enjoy today. Conclusion: the legacy of the stubborn, a toast to the unsung. Heroes of winter as we draw the curtains on this journey through the frost-bitten corridors of medieval winters. It's imperative to pause and reflect on the indomitable spirit of those who braved the cold with nothing but sheer will and communal solidarity. These were not tales of grandeur or epic conquests, but of everyday resilience, of communities that, despite the biting cold and scarce resources, found warmth in unity and purpose in perseverance. The medieval winter was an unrelenting adversary. With the sun retreating early and the nights stretching endlessly, villagers huddled together, sharing not just physical warmth, but stories, songs, and hopes. The communal hearth wasn't merely a source of heat, it was the heart of the village, pulsating with life and camaraderie. Elders, with their tales and wisdom, became the guiding lights, ensuring that traditions were passed down and that the fire, both literal and metaphorical, never extinguished. Yet, despite their best efforts, there were times when nature's fury overwhelmed. Entire communities were silenced, their stories buried beneath layers of snow. But even in these tragedies, lessons were etched into the collective memory, serving as cautionary tales and guiding principles for future generations. The importance of preparation, the value of community, and the need for adaptability became the cornerstones of survival. In today's world, where the mere flick of a switch banishes the cold and a plethora of resources are at our fingertips, it's easy to forget the struggles of our ancestors. But every time we gather with loved ones during the winter months, every shared meal, every story told by the fireplace, is a tribute to those who came before us. Their legacy isn't just in the traditions we've inherited, but in the very fabric of our existence. So, As you wrap yourself in a warm blanket tonight, perhaps with a hot beverage in hand, take a moment to honor the memory of those resilient souls. Reflect on their courage, their unity, and their unwavering spirit. And if this journey through time has touched you, consider sharing it with others. Let's keep their stories alive, ensuring that the legacy of the stubborn continues to inspire and warm hearts for generations to come. If this narrative resonated with you, don't forget to like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more tales from the annals of history. Together, let's keep the flame of the past burning bright. Now that you've seen how your ancestors battled frostbite with mud walls, manure, and sheer stubbornness, take a second. Look at your electric blanket, your insulated windows, your hot shower. That's not just luxury. It's a legacy built on centuries of suffering, creativity, and human resilience. We don't remember their names, but we're living the life they never had. So tonight, when you tuck in warm and safe, maybe whisper a silent thank you to the peasants who froze so you could be cozy. If this story made you laugh, cringe, or just feel thankful for central heating, smash that like button, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more unfiltered, human, hilarious history. Share this video, because their struggle deserves more than a footnote. It deserves to be felt.